Right now, I got a certain trouble that keeps me from working.
You look healthy.
My feet. They keep itching for me to go places.
Because I want to make something of this place. I want to make it into an honest-to-goodness...
Hollywood built them up, put them on magazine covers, and called them legends. Then it quietly closed every door. Some were blacklisted for their politics. Some said the wrong thing to the wrong person. Some simply refused to play along. Here are 19 Golden Age stars you didn't know are banned by Hollywood. 19. Orson Welles. Orson Welles was 25 years old when he made Citizen Kane in 1941, a film that is still, more than 80 years later, regularly cited as the greatest movie ever made. That alone should have guaranteed him a long, celebrated career at the top of the Hollywood system. Instead, it started a war that Welles never really won. The problem was William Randolph Hearst. Citizen Kane was an unmistakable portrait of the media mogul, and Hearst recognized it immediately. He used the full power of his newspaper empire to bury the film, refusing to allow advertising for it, pressuring theater chains not to book it, and instructing his journalists to attack Welles in print at every opportunity. RKO Pictures, which had funded the film, was terrified of the backlash and gave Citizen Kane only a limited release. Welles made a follow-up at RKO, The Magnificent Ambersons, in 1942, which the studio then re-edited without his knowledge while he was filming in Brazil, cutting 50 minutes from the film and destroying the original footage. Welles called it an act of vandalism he never got over. RKO terminated his contract shortly after. For the rest of his career, Welles scrambled for funding, often financing his own projects by acting in other people's films for money he'd then pour into his own work. Othello took 4 years to make because he kept running out of money and had to stop to go earn more. He never directed another major Hollywood studio film after his 30s. He spent much of his later life in Europe, doing commercial voiceover work, most famously for Paul Masson Wines, and talk show appearances in America to keep himself funded. He was still trying to finish his passion project The Other Side of the Wind when he died in October 1985. The film was eventually completed using his original footage and released by Netflix in 2018, 33 years after his death, when the American Film Institute gave him a Lifetime Achievement Award in 1975. The Hollywood establishment acknowledged what it had done to him, honored him handsomely, and decades too late, for a career they had worked hard to prevent. He accepted with characteristic wit and showed no visible bitterness, which, depending on your interpretation, was either great dignity or great acting, probably both. 18. John Garfield. John Garfield was one of the most naturally talented actors of the 1940s, a Brooklyn-born son of immigrants whose rough-edged authenticity was entirely his own and couldn't be manufactured. The Postman Always Rings Twice in 1946, Body and Soul in 1947, Force of Evil in 1948, he played working-class men with a raw energy that predated Marlon Brando and pointed directly toward what American acting would become. Then, the House Un-American Activities Committee came for him. Garfield had been a member of left-wing theater circles in New York in the 1930s, and his associations were enough to put him on the radar of the Hollywood blacklist in the early 1950s. He was called before HUAC in 1951 and refused to name names, refusing to give the committee what it wanted, even though he knew what the cost would be. The studios stopped hiring him, roles dried up. The man who had been nominated for 2 Academy Awards found himself unable to work in the industry he had helped define. The stress of the blacklist, the financial pressure, the social isolation, the constant surveillance and harassment took a visible toll. John Garfield died of a heart attack in May 1952. He was 39 years old. His friends and colleagues were largely convinced that the treatment he received at the hands of HUAC and the Hollywood blacklist had contributed directly to his death. He had not named names, he had not cooperated, and Hollywood had destroyed him for it. 17. Anne Revere. Anne Revere won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress in 1946 for her performance in National Velvet, playing Elizabeth Taylor's mother with a quiet dignity that the Academy recognized as something special. It should have been the beginning of a long run of important roles. Instead, it was nearly the end. Revere was named as a communist sympathizer by the House Un-American Activities Committee and was called to testify in 1951. She refused to cooperate with the committee, invoking the Fifth Amendment rather than naming colleagues. 1940s and was promptly blacklisted. The work stopped almost immediately. She did not appear in another Hollywood film for over 2 decades. She returned to the stage in New York, where the blacklist had somewhat less stranglehold, and continued working in theater through the 1950s and 1960s. But the film career that her Oscar had seemed to promise simply vanished. She finally returned to the screen in Birch Interval in 1976 and received a Tony Award nomination for stage work in 1960, demonstrating that the talent was always there. Hollywood just had no interest in it for 20 years. She died in 1990, and the full arc of what was taken from her has never been adequately reckoned with. 16. Dalton Trumbo. Dalton Trumbo was one of the highest paid screenwriters in Hollywood when the blacklist came for him. He had written Kitty Foyle in 1940, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo in 1944, and had been nominated for awards and commanded enormous fees. He was at the very top of his profession. He was one of the Hollywood 10 writers and directors who refused to cooperate with HUAC in 1947 and were cited for contempt of Congress as a result. All 10 were blacklisted. Trumbo and 9 others were sentenced to prison. He served 11 months in a federal penitentiary in Kentucky. After his release, Trumbo continued writing under pseudonyms and through frontmen, other writers who would put their names on his work for a fee. In 1953, he wrote Roman Holiday under the name Ian McClellan Hunter. In 1956, he wrote The Brave One under the name Robert Rich. When The Brave One won the Academy Award, nobody came forward to collect it, because the real writer was a blacklisted felon. The blacklist effectively ended for Trumbo in 1960 when Kirk Douglas insisted that Trumbo receive on-screen credit for Spartacus, and Otto Preminger simultaneously credited him for Exodus. President-elect John F. Kennedy crossed a picket line to see Spartacus, which helped signal that the political climate had shifted. Trumbo's story was told in a 2015 biopic starring Bryan Cranston. He died in 1976. 15. Gail Sondergaard. Gail Sondergaard won the very first Academy Award ever given for Best Supporting Actress in 1937 for Anthony Adverse. She was a formidable presence in Hollywood through the 1930s and 1940s, frequently cast as icy, dangerous women in films like The Letter and Anna and The King of Siam. Her husband was the director Herbert Biberman, one of the Hollywood 10. When HUAC came calling in 1951, Sondergaard was also asked to testify. She initially planned to fight, writing a public letter to the Screen Actors Guild asking for their support. The guild, then led by Ronald Reagan, responded by essentially telling her she was on her own. She was subsequently blacklisted. Sondergaard did not work in Hollywood film for nearly 2 decades. Like many blacklisted performers, she found some refuge in stage work and in occasional television appearances produced outside the studio system. She returned to film in the late 1960s and worked sporadically through the 1970s before her death in 1985. The Screen Actors Guild, the organization that had declined to support her in 1951, eventually apologized for its handling of the blacklist era in 1997, acknowledging that the guild had failed its members. For Sondergaard and many others, that apology arrived about 40 years too late to matter professionally. 14. Lupe Velez. Lupe Velez was one of the most vivid personalities of early Hollywood, a Mexican actress who arrived in the late 1920s and became known as the Mexican Spitfire, a nickname she earned through a combination of genuine fiery energy and the studio's enthusiasm for marketing her as an exotic commodity. She made dozens of films through the 1930s, was a genuine box office draw, and had a personal life that kept the gossip columns busy for years, including a famously turbulent marriage to actor Johnny Weissmuller. Her problems with Hollywood were less about blacklisting and more about the industry's systematic devaluation of Latin American performers during the studio era. The roles that were available to her were largely stereotypes: the hot-tempered Latin woman, the exotic temptress, and as the 1930s gave way to the 1940s and tastes shifted, those roles became scarcer. The studios that had profited from her work showed little interest in evolving her image or investing in her career at a new level. Velez died by suicide died in December 1944 at the age of 36. She left a note that was dignified and heartbreaking. The circumstances of her death were subsequently sensationalized by the tabloid press in ways that were cruel and inaccurate, and the distorted version of the story persisted for decades. What she represented, the cost of Hollywood's treatment of performers from outside its preferred demographic, was something the industry was not prepared to examine honestly in 1944 and has only partially reckoned with since. 13. Sterling Hayden. Sterling Hayden made a choice that haunted him for the rest of his life. A former World War II hero and OSS operative who had worked with the Yugoslav partisans, Hayden had briefly been a member of the Communist Party in 1946, a decision he later described as a youthful mistake made in the disorientation following the war. When HUACS called him in 1951, he named names. He gave the committee what it wanted. He was not blacklisted. He worked steadily through the 1950s and beyond. The Asphalt Jungle with John Huston in 1950, Johnny Guitar in 1954, Dr. Strangelove in 1964, The Godfather in 1972. The career continued, but Hayden never forgave himself. He wrote about his testimony in his 1963 memoir, Wanderer, with a self-lacerating honesty that was extraordinary for its time, calling himself a rat for what he had done, describing the testimony as the worst thing he ever did. He said that he had been pressured by his psychiatrist and his lawyer, that he had been afraid, and that the fear had led him to betray people he had no right to betray. The colleagues he named were blacklisted. Some of them never worked again in Hollywood. Hayden went on to have a long career, and he spent much of it unable to look at himself in the mirror for what that career had cost other people. He died in 1986. His memoir remains one of the most painfully honest documents produced by anyone who passed through the blacklist era. 12. Judy Holliday. Judy Holliday won the Academy Award for Best Actress in 1951 for Born Yesterday, a comedic performance of such precision and intelligence that it beat out Bette Davis and Anne Baxter for the prize. She was funny, warm, and genuinely one of the most gifted comic actresses Hollywood had ever produced. She was also under investigation by HUAC. Her name had appeared on lists connected to left-wing organizations, and the committee subpoenaed her. Holliday's response was strategic and clever. She played the committee members by performing the ditzy persona of her Born Yesterday character in real life, feigning confusion and presenting herself as a naive woman who had signed petitions without really understanding them. The performance worked in the sense that she was not formally blacklisted and continued to work, but the cloud never entirely lifted. The FBI maintained a file on her. Studios were cautious. The roles that might have come her way were slower to arrive, and the creative freedom she might have had at the height of her powers was constrained by the awareness that she was being watched. She died in 1965 at the age of 43 from breast cancer. Her film career was relatively short, roughly a decade of significant work, and the question of what she might have done with more time, in a climate that didn't treat her talent as a potential liability, is one that film historians have pondered ever since. 11. Will Geer. Will Geer is best remembered today as Grandpa Walton on The Waltons, the warm, beloved television series that ran from 1972 to 1981. Audiences who grew up watching that show would be surprised to learn that Geer spent most of the 1950s unable to work in Hollywood at all. Geer was a committed political activist who had been involved with left-wing causes since the 1930s. He was a close friend of Woody Guthrie and had been an active supporter of labor organizing and civil rights causes long before such positions were fashionable. When HUAC came for him, he refused to cooperate, refused entirely, unlike some who named names to protect themselves. He was blacklisted and remained so for years. He retreated to his property in Topanga Canyon, California, where he and his family built a garden and an outdoor theater, the Theatricum Botanicum, which still exists today as a working theater. He grew vegetables, raised his children, and waited out the blacklist doing whatever work he could find outside the studio system. When the blacklist era faded, Geer gradually returned to work. By the time the Waltons arrived in 1972, he was 70 years old. He had been denied 2 decades of what should have been his prime professional years. The warmth and humanity that audiences loved in Grandpa Walton were real, but the man who brought them to the screen had paid a price that most of those audiences never knew anything about. 10. Kim Hunter. Kim Hunter won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress in 1952 for A Streetcar Named Desire, playing Stella Kowalski opposite Marlon Brando in the film adaptation of Tennessee Williams's play. It was a performance of great emotional intelligence and physical commitment. She was 29 years old and seemed on the verge of a major career. Then she was named in Red Channels, the publication that became a kind of blacklist Bible in the early 1950s, listing entertainers with alleged communist ties. Studios stopped calling. Television networks, which might otherwise have been a refuge, were also cautious about hiring anyone on the list. Hunter managed to survive professionally better than some, partly through stage work and eventually through television and film appearances. As the blacklist era wound down, she is also known to younger audiences for her role as Dr. Zira in the original Planet of the Apes in 1968. But the years between her Oscar and her return to consistent film work were professionally barren in ways they had no business being. She had won the Academy Award at 29. The career that should have followed simply didn't materialize, derailed by a political climate that treated talent as secondary to ideology. 9. Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was one of the most extraordinary figures in American cultural history. A concert bass baritone of world-class caliber, a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Rutgers, who had also been an All-American football player, a trained lawyer who never practiced, an actor who had played Othello on Broadway to standing ovations year after year, and a committed civil rights activist at a time when that commitment carried real and immediate consequences. The American government revoked his passport in 1950, citing his refusal to sign an affidavit stating that he was not a communist. Without a passport, he could not travel to perform abroad, effectively cutting off the international concert career that was a primary source of both his income and his audience. The State Department held his passport for 8 years, during which he was prohibited from leaving the country. During that period, Robeson was effectively erased from American public life. His recordings were pulled from radio stations. His name was quietly removed from the record books at Rutgers, where he had been a celebrated alumnus. The cultural establishment that had once celebrated him pretended he had never existed, with an efficiency that is remarkable in retrospect. The Supreme Court ruled in 1958 that the State Department could not withhold a passport on political grounds, and Robeson got his back. He left the United States and spent years performing abroad. He returned in 1963, but his health had deteriorated significantly during the years of systematic persecution, and he never recaptured his earlier prominence. He died in Philadelphia in January 1976. His exclusion from American cultural memory was so thorough that many Americans of the post-war generation grew up having never heard of him, which, given who he was and what he had accomplished, remains one of the stranger achievements of mid-century political suppression. 8. Lillian Hellman. Lillian Hellman was one of the most celebrated playwrights in American history. The Children's Hour, The Little Foxes, Watch on the Rhine, and also one of the most politically engaged figures in Hollywood's history. She had written screenplays and worked in the film industry alongside her partner. When HUAC summoned her in 1952, Hellman responded with a letter that became one of the most famous documents of the blacklist era. She told the committee she would not cut her conscience to fit that year's fashions, a line that has been quoted ever since. She was willing to testify about herself, she said, but she would not name others. The committee was not satisfied. She was cited, her income collapsed, and she and Hammett had to sell their farm in Westchester. The blacklist effectively removed Hellman from Hollywood for years. Hammett himself had already been imprisoned for refusing to give the names of contributors to a civil rights bail fund. The two of them lived under significant financial strain through much of the 1950s. Hellman returned to prominence eventually. Her 1969 memoir, An Unfinished Woman, won the National Book Award, and her work was revived extensively in the 1970s. But the productive years she should have had in the 1950s, at the height of her creative powers, were largely lost to persecution by a committee she had told, in the most dignified terms possible, to mind its own business. 7. Hedy Lamarr. Hedy Lamarr's story is different from the others on this list. She wasn't blacklisted for politics, and she wasn't destroyed by a single scandal. Her exclusion from Hollywood was slower, more insidious, and perhaps more revealing of how the industry treated women who had the misfortune of aging. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, Lamarr was promoted as the most beautiful woman in the world, and the studio system used that description as both a marketing tool and a cage. MGM put her in glamorous roles that emphasized her looks and minimized everything else, including the fact that she was, by any measure, a genuinely intelligent woman. In 1942, while under contract to MGM and appearing in movies, she co-developed with composer George Antheil a frequency-hopping spread-spectrum communication system intended to make radio-guided torpedoes harder for enemies to detect. They received a patent in 1942. The military didn't use the technology until the 1960s. By then, the patent had expired. Lamar received no financial compensation. Meanwhile, her film career had faded as her MGM contract expired and the roles for women over 40, which Hollywood has always treated as a near-extinct category, dried up. She became increasingly reclusive from the 1950s onward, and a 1966 shoplifting arrest brought humiliating publicity that she found deeply distressing. She died in January 2000. The Electronic Frontier Foundation recognized her contribution to communications technology in 1997 with a Pioneer Award, and she was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame posthumously in 2014. Hollywood remembered her as a beautiful face. The fuller picture took everyone else much longer to see. 6. Louise Brooks. Louise Brooks was one of the most electrifying screen presences of the silent film era, a dancer turned actress from Kansas whose work in 2 German films directed by G.W. Pabst, Pandora's Box and Diary of a Lost Girl, both made in 1929, established her as one of the genuine artists of early cinema. Her performance in Pandora's Box is still considered among the finest in film history. Her relationship with Hollywood, however, was one of mutual contempt. She had walked out on her Paramount contract in 1928 to go to Germany to make those films, which Paramount viewed as an act of professional betrayal. When she returned, the studio was not welcoming. She was given only minor roles and found herself effectively sidelined. Brooks later gave a series of extraordinary interviews collected in her 1982 book Lulu in Hollywood, in which she described the Hollywood system with a clarity and acidity that left little room for sentimentality. She named names and described the casting couch culture of the studio era with a frankness that was unusual for any woman of her generation to commit to print. She had largely retired from acting by the mid-1930s, still in her 20s, and spent decades working as a salesgirl and in other jobs before being rediscovered by film scholars in the 1950s. She lived her final years in Rochester, New York, writing and corresponding with critics and historians who had finally recognized what the industry had discarded. She died in 1985. 5. Frances Farmer. Frances Farmer was a Seattle-born actress who arrived in Hollywood in the mid-1930s with natural talent, striking looks, and a fierce independent streak that the studio system found inconvenient from the start. She was under contract to Paramount and appeared in a series of films through the late 1930s, including Come and Get It in 1936, in which she gave a performance that drew serious critical attention. Her problems with Hollywood and with authority more broadly escalated through the early 1940s. She had leftist political sympathies that had drawn attention during the HUAC era. She also had conflicts with Paramount's control over her career, refusing to take roles she considered beneath her, and pushing back against the studio in ways that executives found deeply unwelcome. A series of arrests in 1942 and 1943, on charges ranging from a traffic violation to a drunk and disorderly incident, led to encounters with the legal system and ultimately to her involuntary commitment to a state psychiatric facility in Washington, where she spent several years. The conditions of her treatment during that period were brutal, even by the standards of the time. She attempted a return to acting in the 1950s, hosting a television show in Indianapolis for several years, but the Hollywood career was gone. She died in 1970. A 1982 film biography starring Jessica Lange brought renewed attention to her story, and the portrait that emerged was of a woman who had been ground up by a system that punished nonconformity, especially in women, without mercy. 4. John Huston's blacklist targets. John Huston, the director of The Maltese Falcon, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, and The African Queen, was one of the most powerful figures in Hollywood when the blacklist took hold, and he initially tried to fight it. In 1947, he co-founded the Committee for the First Amendment alongside William Wyler and Philip Dunn, organizing a group of Hollywood celebrities who flew to Washington to protest the HUAC hearings publicly. The effort failed. The studios made clear that resistance was commercially dangerous, and the Committee for the First Amendment quietly dissolved. Huston subsequently left for Europe, directing importing several of his most celebrated films from abroad, in part because the political climate in Hollywood had become suffocating. The writers and directors Huston had tried to protect were largely blacklisted anyway. The lesson of the episode was blunt. Even the most powerful directors in Hollywood were not powerful enough to protect their colleagues from a congressional committee that had the backing of the studio heads. Huston himself was never blacklisted, but his attempt to organize resistance is worth remembering because it's one of the few cases in which someone with real institutional power tried to use it in the right direction and failed, which was its own kind of instruction in how the system worked. 3. Marsha Hunt. Marsha Hunt had been a busy and reliable presence in Hollywood through the 1940s, appearing in Pride and Prejudice in 1940, The Human Comedy in 1943, and dozens of other studio productions. She was not a major star on the order of Bette Davis or Katharine Hepburn, but she was a working actress with a solid career and genuine talent. She was one of the Hollywood celebrities who flew to Washington with John Huston's Committee for the First Amendment in 1947, publicly opposing the HUAC hearings. That act of civic courage effectively ended her Hollywood career. She was placed on the informal blacklist maintained by the studios, and the roles that had been coming regularly stopped coming at all. Hunt eventually moved to television and continued working in that medium, where the blacklist had somewhat less grip than it did in film, and she became increasingly active in social causes, including homelessness advocacy, which occupied much of her later life. She was one of the last surviving participants in the blacklist era, and in interviews given in her 90s, she spoke about what had happened with a composed and measured directness. She never disguised the cost. She also never disguised the fact that, given the same choice again, she would have gotten on the plane. She died in 2022 at the age of 104. 2. Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was one of the most famous human beings on Earth for most of the first half of the 20th century. A man who had come from profound poverty in Victorian London to become the defining figure of silent cinema and one of the first global entertainment icons. The Kid, City Lights, Modern Times, The Great Dictator. His body of work was extraordinary by any measure. His relationship with the United States government had been tense for years. He had never applied for American citizenship despite living in the country for decades. His political views, which leaned leftward and included criticism of fascism in The Great Dictator years before America entered the war, had attracted FBI surveillance since at least the 1940s. J. Edgar Hoover was personally invested in building a case against him. In 1952, Chaplin sailed to England for the premiere of Limelight. While he was at sea, the Attorney General revoked his re-entry permit, effectively barring him from returning to the United States pending a hearing on his moral worth, which was both a reference to his political views and to his personal life, including a relationship with a much younger woman that had generated scandal. Chaplin chose not to fight it. He settled in Vevey, Switzerland with his wife Una O'Neill and their children and did not return to the United States for 20 years. He made 2 more films in Europe, A King in New York in 1957, which satirized McCarthyism with barely concealed fury, and A Countess from Hong Kong in 1967, but neither matched the cultural weight of his American work. When he finally came back in 1972 to accept an honorary Oscar, the Academy's belated acknowledgement of what his work had meant to the history of cinema, he received a 12-minute standing ovation that, by several accounts, moved him to tears. He was 82 years old. The country that had effectively expelled him was now applauding him in a ballroom in Los Angeles, and the gap between those two facts said everything that needed to be said about how history eventually judges these things. He died in Switzerland on Christmas Day, 1977, having spent the last quarter of his life in exile from the country that had made him one of the most famous people in the world, and then decided it didn't want him anymore. 1. Elia Kazan. Elia Kazan directed A Streetcar Named Desire in 1951, On the Waterfront in 1954, East of Eden in 1955, and Gentleman's Agreement in 1947, films that between them earned dozens of Academy Award nominations and helped define what American cinema could be. He also co-founded the Actors Studio in New York in 1947, which trained a generation of performers who transformed American acting. Marlon Brando, James Dean, and many others passed through those doors. He was, by the early 1950s, one of the most important directors working anywhere in the world. In 1952, Kazan testified before HUAC and named names, 8 former members of the Communist Party, whom he had known through the group theater in New York in the 1930s. His testimony gave the committee what it wanted, and the 8 people he named were blacklisted. Several of them never worked in Hollywood again. The playwright Arthur Miller, who was one of his closest friends at the time, ended their friendship over the testimony and never fully repaired it. The reason Kazan cooperated, and he was specific about this in subsequent interviews and in his 1988 autobiography, A Life, was that he believed the Soviet Union represented a genuine ideological threat, and that Stalinism was a monstrous system worth exposing. He also acknowledged, more quietly, that his own career would have been destroyed had he refused. Both things were likely true, and the combination did not make for a comfortable legacy to carry for 50 years. When the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences gave Kazan an honorary Oscar in 1999, the ceremony became one of the most charged cultural moments in the history of that stage. Several prominent directors and actors refused to applaud or sat with their hands in their laps. Others gave a standing ovation. The division in that room, nearly 50 years after the testimony, illustrated something important about how the industry remembered what had happened and who had paid the price. Kazan died in September 2003. His films are still among the greatest ever made. The names he gave were not forgotten, by the people who bore the cost, or by history. 19 people. Some of them were destroyed by a political machine that didn't care what it crushed. Some made choices under pressure that they spent the rest of their lives regretting. Some were simply women or immigrants or people of color in an industry that decided their inconvenience outweighed their talent. The golden age of Hollywood was glamorous from a distance. The premieres, the contracts, the names on the marquees. Up close, it was something else. It was a system that controlled nearly everything about the people who worked inside it, and when those people stepped out of line, or were merely accused of stepping out of line, the consequences were real and lasting. Most of the names on this list deserved better than they got. A few of them knew it, all of them lived it. If this one stayed with you, hit that like button and subscribe. There's a lot more history waiting.